Please sit down. Please sit down. Please. You know, I really appreciate that, but I am one of those folks that is very humbled by who I think are the greater leaders. When you're a United States Senator, Senator Markey knows this, you have chances to stand in the spotlight and before the press and work and the like, but there are so many people that labor in our communities every single day, the humble heroes with their hands on the plow, that don't get the recognition, that make extraordinary sacrifice. I have a life replete with those folks, and I cannot tell you that this coming week, I have a chance to surprise someone for her 90th birthday. I mean, she is this woman who has so changed my life because in the 1960s, when my parents had met and married here in Washington, D.C., my parents then, thanks to the activism of folks in this city, at a time that corporations and companies were not hiring African Americans. It was folks in this city and organizations like the Urban League that fought to get qualified African Americans their shots at jobs. And my dad became one of the first black salesmen or buyers for Woody's, Woodruff and Latham, one of the first black salesmen for an oil company called Sinclair Oil. Then he became IBM's first black salesman in the entire Virginia area. And then you all know this, often when people who are not allowed at the table can come to the table, they feel like they gotta work twice as hard, you know, show up early, stay late to try to prove themselves. And so through that effort, my dad became extraordinarily successful as a salesman, IBM's top 5% global salesman, but then got promoted to Manhattan, Madison Avenue, tried to find places to live in New Jersey, and then could not break through the housing discrimination that was going on at the time in predominantly or all white neighborhoods. And it was a group of activists, lawyers, and others, an organization called the Fair Housing Council back in the mid-60s who began trying to represent these families, would send out test couples right behind my parents when they were lied to and told the house was sold or pulled off the market. My parents would literally find a house that they loved and then be told it was sold. White couple would show up and find out that it was still for sale. On the house that I grew up in, my parents so loved it in a small town, they were told the house was sold. The white couple found out it was for sale. The white couple put a bid on the house. On the day of the papers drawn up, and on the day of the closing, the white couple didn't show up. My father did, and a volunteer lawyer marched into the real estate agent's office. A real estate agent was so upset that he had got caught in this sting, no contrition, no act for apology, stands up and punches my dad's lawyer in the face and sigs a dog on my dad. Now, I will tell you that every time my dad would tell the story, the dog would get bigger. But that's how I moved into a town that my dad would call us the four raisins in a tub of sweet vanilla ice cream, that by the time I was a teenager and had all that teenage swagger, my dad would try to cut me down to size and inform me that, you know, don't dare walk around this house like you hit a triple, young man. You were born on third base. And so imagine this, decades later, I become a United States Senator in a special election. I was sworn in on a very auspicious day on the American calendar, Halloween. And, but my mom, having had my dad die 6 days before I was elected, decides to take me to see John Lewis. I go to see John Lewis. The last thing I do as a United States Senator before I'm being sworn in as the fourth African-American ever elected in the history of our country, the United States Senate. And I sit with John Lewis, a hero of mine, and see this profound humility that he has. This is unbelievable. He wouldn't let my mom and I get up to get more eggs and grits. He's serving us. His office is a museum. And my mom is working hard as we walk from his office to Harry Reid to go to the vice president and get sworn in. It's like she feels as if this is the last speech she's ever gonna give me, so she is filling my ear. Boy, don't you forget what got you here. Boy, don't you forget the struggle. You know, I'm like wondering to myself, how many United States senators got lectured by their mothers on their way to get sworn in like this? Boy, don't you forget that the title doesn't make the man has got to make the title. Now, what I didn't know about that meeting with John Lewis was how truly it was that he and agents in this generation were actually directly responsible, because I went to go write a book last year and I didn't want to have I love all of our Americans, both sides of the aisle. I'm friends with Ben Carson, but I saw what happened to him. I didn't want to have a Ben Carson moment and start telling stories like, my father, that dog, was it a dog, or was it, by the end of his life, it was a pack of wolves that he fought off? So I went back to fact check these stories, and amazingly, I went to find the head of the Fair Housing Council. Now, she was easy to find. This is the woman I'm going to surprise next week, because she is still the head of the Fair Housing Council. It's her 90th birthday. She represents now not black families, but Muslim families, same-sex couples, never faltered, no fame, nobody knows her name. She doesn't have followers on social media because she doesn't have social media. She never mistook the urgency of the moment, understanding that it is not about celebrity, it is about significance. It is not about position, it is about purpose. And when I interviewed her, she told me I should find the lawyers that helped my family. I went to go find them. I found a man, young white lawyer, just starting out, barely making ends meet, struggling to support his family. I asked him, why would he help all these black families? He said, because I was so moved. I made this decision on a Monday. I go, how do you remember it was a Monday? He goes, because that Sunday, Cory, I was watching on TV, a bunch of folk try to cross a bridge in Alabama, and they got beaten with billy clubs. And I was so struck, I went to the office the next day and said, we have got to go to Alabama. My partner said, laugh, because he knew he couldn't even afford to be away from the office one day. And so then he said, we've got to do the best we can with what we have, where we are. And in essence, they started calling around who needs lawyers to volunteer. And it was the Fair Housing Council. A few years later, they get a case file with Cory and Carolyn Booker, my parents, on it. Now, that is power. It's the power of love that knows no bounds. You cannot confine one act of love and justice. This act, marchers whose names I don't know, in an instant, their love leaped geography from Alabama to New Jersey, changed hearts. It leaped time and space to affect generations not yet born. We're here for an award named after a man who kept his hand on the plow and fought for justice, never grew comfortable indulging in the worst type of privilege an American can indulge in, that there's a serious problem out there, but it doesn't affect me or my family personally, so it's not that much of a problem. Or the seduction of the state of sedentary agitation, when you're so upset about what's happening in the world, but you don't get up and do something about it. Or fall into that trap where you allow your inability to do everything to undermine your determination just to do something in the cause of justice. We're here celebrating that spirit and that understanding that we are all in this together. That, as King says, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a common garment of destiny, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so please know, I feel blessed to be a part of a community in New Jersey. I've lived my entire professional life and worked in Newark, New Jersey. I go home as the senator that goes home to the census tract. It is the poorest of all the 100 of us. I live in a community where the median income is $14,000. And all around me are heroes. I moved and lived for 8 years in these high-rise, low-income projects, led by a woman who was the tenant president from the first tenant meeting all the way into the buildings closed in 2006. Miss Virginia Jones. Her son served in the military, murdered in the lobby of those buildings in the 80s. And I remember looking at her and asking her, why does she still live there? She and I in those buildings were the two of the highest net worth earners. We could have lived a lot of other places. I wanted to know, after her son was murdered in those buildings, why she would still stay. People would have understood her grief. Grief I can't even imagine. And she looks at me almost insulted by the question. She goes, why do I still live here? I go, yes. She goes, why am I still in apartment 5A? I go, yes. She's like, why am I still the tenant president? I say, yes, and I also want to know about that electoral longevity. She goes, because Cory, I am in charge of Homeland Security. That's that choice we have every day of our lives, to accept things as they are or take responsibility for changing them. And so the heroes we're honoring today, I want you to know, they're from that tradition. Not the people that stand in the light, that command the cameras, that have hundreds of thousands of people that want to see what they're eating for lunch. They have not grown comfortable with injustice. They have not allowed injustice to normalize. They are disturbed. They are disquiet. And they live their lives in accordance to the commands of their conscience. I stand with humility before them because I have made mistake after mistake. And that's what I want to share with you, is just a mistake where I didn't honor my history, where I didn't honor the legacy I inherited, where I didn't honor my family tradition. I lived in those buildings for 8 years. I watched kids grow up. I've lived in nice places. Those buildings had infestations with roaches and mice, elevators that would not cooperate. I'm a man of faith. I think God has dominion over the world, but I think that the devil has possessed public housing elevators. Heat and hot water that was not in any way routine. It took me years after moving out of there to fall into now the assumption most Americans have that when you turn the water on, water will come out and it'll be warm. Walking down the steps, 16 flights, having to step over. People literally stand and check to make sure they were alive. This is uncomfortable for a 20-something, 30-something young man, but there were families that lived in there, elderly folks that lived in there, and I described the conditions, but I also want to let you know it was probably one of the best communities I've ever been a part of, with leaders like Ms. Jones, Ms. Yancey, Ms. Williams, incredible, incredible, mostly African-American women who held that community together with the force of their will. Now, the kids I watched growing up in that neighborhood, a lot of them hung out in the lobby of my building, and I got into politics, became a city councilperson, ran for mayor in 2002, lost. For those of you who are gonna have a spectacular failure in your life, I really recommend having a documentary team there to capture it. Made for a great movie, until it lost in the Oscars to March of the Dagnab Penguins. Morgan Freeman. And so much of my life was about coming back. It was about the next election. We took a bad loss, but the next election, looking 4 years later. Politics, that was my focus. We're gonna win the next time. And I made a beeline organizing my life for the next election. Yet I'm surrounded by people who are like, wait a minute, we need to be in the fight for the next day. And the kids I watched grow up, they couldn't wait 4 years of their lives. I'm walking into at night on these days and just see these young fellas. One of them, Hassan Washington, was like my father, born to a single mom, born in a segregated environment, born poor. He and my dad had eerie parallels to the fact both of them were raised for a while by their grandparents. He lived with his grandma 4 floors below me, and as I watched them grow up, as I got closer to that next election, I would hang out in the lobby with them, but one day I came home and I smelled something so pungent, I hadn't really smelled it that pungent since I was at Stanford. Now, we all know, in this room especially, that we have two different justice systems. There's a justice system for communities like I grew up in. There's a justice system for people that have gone to Stanford. There is no difference in America for drug use or drug selling between races. None. In fact, some studies show that young white men might have a little higher rates of drug dealing, but nobody's stopping and frisking folks coming home from Stanford. Nobody's setting up an FBI investigation saying, let's break that drug ring on college campuses where they're selling Adderall and marijuana and cocaine and ecstasy. No difference. But yet, if you're African American, you're 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, for doing things that the last two presidents admitted to doing. Felonies, not marijuana. And if you're black and poor, if you're poor, period, we have a justice system that preys upon the poor and the minority and the weak. Our prisons are full we have a debtor's prison, in fact, because when one person if I get arrested tomorrow, I'm paying bail, I'm out. But just because I have a higher net worth, my liberty is dependent upon my income. So poor people stay in prison and jails, which have 9 times the admissions in our prisons do, for weeks, for months, children in conditions that other countries call torture, like juvenile solitary confinement. And the pressure on folks in this system that preys upon the poor, the mentally ill, the drug addicted, the pressure to plead guilty is a whole lot different than it was a couple generations ago, before mandatory minimums. 3 strikes, you're out. I had a young man in my office the other day, arrested for a crime. His public defender trying to do the best they could, say, hey, they're offering you can get out now. Get your liberty, you'll have a felony arrest, but you'll be liberated. If you don't take this deal, they're gonna put you into adult court and they're threatening you with 43 years. A whole book written why innocent people plead guilty. Plea bargaining ain't a fair bargain. And people don't understand. I grew up in the time reading the book in high school, 12 Angry Men. We don't have juries and trials like that anymore. 98% of our trials don't happen. 98% of our criminal convictions are plea bargains. This kid had the strength and fortitude to risk 4 decades of his life and take the shot, was proven innocent. I'm looking at these kids in the lobby, and I know one arrest, and already you have strikes against you because you were born poor in America, where only 9 out of 100 poor kids in this country go to college. Not only do you have strikes against you because you live in an environmental nightmare. Flint, Michigan isn't the only city that's toxic. Dioxins in our soil, in our water, air that causes epidemic levels of asthma. These kids have enough strikes against them. But if you have a criminal conviction in this country for doing things the last 2 presidents admitted to, a whole lot of Congress did, that you won't get caught of if you grew up in neighborhoods like mine, you won't get caught doing, and if you do, people give you a pass in places like Stanford. They get caught. Now they face what the American Bar Association says is 40,000 collateral consequences. You're checking boxes, you can't get jobs, you can't get loans, you can't get Pell Grants, business licenses. People in my community can't get a taxi license even if it was 20 years ago. Pell Grants, food stamps, public housing. You're condemned to a system that literally straitjackets your ability to provide for your children. And the crazy thing is, it's an economic hit, not just to those families. One study has come out now that we'd have 20% less poverty in America if we had incarceration rates the same as other cities, as other industrial nations. But we in America, we love paying a gross amount of money to support this unjust system. We live in a nation that was building a new prison every 10 days between the time I was in law school and the time I got to be mayor of the city of Newark. Billions of dollars of infrastructure. Here in the federal government, we literally have an increase on federal spending, 45% for prisons since 1998, but it cut spending on local law enforcement and state law enforcement by 76% during that same time. We're plowing money into this broken system. And so when I walk into the lobby and smell marijuana, please understand, all of those alarm bells go off for me. And I decide I got to intervene. So I stop and start talking with the kids, and I see dangerous stuff. I see little gang tags I hadn't seen before in my lobby. And so I started talking. I said, hey, fellas, let's go out. Let's do what we always come and just talk late at night. Let's do something together. I said, pick a movie, any movie you want. Let's go out to the movies. I thought I'd start with that, which was a mistake because they picked Saw 2. Why would they make a 2? I took them out to dinner. I decided to bring in buddies of mine, friends of mine who had been involved in the drug world, not privileged kids from the suburbs like me, kids that grew up in the same community, started that fellowship, made commitments to them that I was going to try to get some mentoring programs for them, help them pursue their desire. I still remember one kid dreamed of having a car auto repair shop, and it was good, but then I got busy. I was busy because the mayor's election came around. And so now I'm focused on politics. I'm focused on the big election. I'm assuaging myself by saying, hey, Cory, you can help them, help all the kids of the city when you're mayor. Kids still in my lobby, I still was spelling pot. And when I'd come home during the campaign, even though I hadn't followed through on all my plans for them, they cheered when I came in. And I'm not exaggerating, literally would cheer me on at night coming home from a long day of campaigning. These kids told me they had my back. One of them, Hassan's like, man, I'm going to vote for you. I'm going to get everybody to vote for you. And I said, I like the latter part. The former's not so good because you're not old enough to vote, brother. One day I come home and they have literally a phalanx of signs, lawn signs, my lawn signs. They form like a parade line. I'm walking through the lobby, and they're chanting what I dreamed of at that title, Mayor Booker, Mayor Booker. I walked in, elevators opened up. I don't know if they were working or not, but they lifted those elevators. And it wasn't until I got to the 16th floor that I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, where'd they get those lawn signs from? They're expensive. I won the election. FBI warns us that we have credible death threats, so they surround me with security, put security in brick towers, the safest they had been in a long time, stationed in the lobby and by my door. Now, I don't care who you are in this room. When you're a teenager, you wouldn't like hanging out where the cops are. So I didn't see the guys anymore coming home, and I got busy being mayor. I'm the mayor now. Most powerful position in the city. I'm off to do big things. We had lots of violence at that time, and I was rushing around to street corners, talking to the crowds who would gather and tell them, this is not who we are. I was trying to lift the spirit with my energy and my plans. One day, I come to Court Street in Newark. 2 people shot, 1 covered dead, the other one being put in an ambulance. I barely affirmed the humanity on the sidewalk. I talked to the police, get a quick report. It was right by a senior building. I start talking to people, giving a street-level sermon. I go a long day, and I come home. That night, trying to steal a couple hours of sleep before getting back on that big mission, and I'm going through my BlackBerry, and I see the police report. Homicide. Reading further through, and then the name of the homicide victim. I will never forget those 2 words, Hassan Washington. The guy in my lobby, the kid who said he had my back, God put him right in front of me. And as I raced for my dream of a political victory, I raced right past him. I will never forget that funeral. Perry's Funeral Home, the one room in the basement of that building, and I hated going into that basement. It was these narrow steps like you were descending into a bowel of a ship, and there we were, packed in that room on top of each other, chained together in grief, moaning and crying and wailing over another American reality that happens every day, another boy in a box. And I felt shame and anger and rage, hurt, guilt. I was choking in it all. An obesity of emotions just sinking me lower. And now I was the mayor. I had people who were coming to me for comfort, but I had nothing to give. And I couldn't stay. I turned to the security detail next to me and I said, "We're leaving." I rushed out of that funeral home basement, ran to City Hall, slammed the door of this new palatial office and collapsed on my couch, and I wept. Who had I become? I'm here because folks saw my dad and wouldn't let him fail. When his mama couldn't take care of him, they took him into their home. When there was no college in my family, they bent the arc of the history of our families. People marched for him and fought for him and bled for him and scrubbed toilets for him. And I encounter a son who's like my dad and couldn't rise to that occasion. We are in a nation where the idea of neighbor has nothing to do with geography, has nothing to do with the kid on your block. It has to do with love, and how deep is our love? How grand is our love? Can we look into the face of children and know that they are our children, that when they die, a part of us is dying too? Can we stand idly by and watch a system gobble up millions of Americans, decimating and destroying lives with no rationale, no common sense whatsoever? A system that makes our streets more dangerous and more poor. A system that takes victims, survivors of sexual abuse, and criminalizes them. A system that takes people already broken and breaks them more. This week has been a tough one for all of us, but the odds have been greater, the challenges more severe. And I live in communities where people have never, ever given up, with people who have seen the darkness and the blackness and the hate and the failures and the pain. And worse than all of that, they've seen the apathy and the indifference of people who just don't seem to care enough. And in a world that couldn't care less, they stand up and say, "I couldn't care more." That woman, Miss Virginia Jones, gave me advice that I hold on to. And that's where I want to share with you. I'll share it in words, but we honor a legacy of someone who shared it in deeds, in the light that he gave. People who share it not with their hands over their hearts and symbols of patriotism, but they live it with their hands outstretched. Miss Virginia Jones, after a death of a teenage boy, when I was broken and felt like giving up, when I felt blackness and pain, I descended in those elevators on an early morning, came through the lobby where her son was killed, into the courtyard, and there she is across the courtyard. Elderly, 5-foot smidgen tall woman, back turned towards me, and I walk into that lobby choking on the obesity of grief, drowning 100 feet underwater, and I see her Just the back of her head, and I stop in my tracks. And then she turns around and she sees me and says no words. She just opens her arms. She's a little woman, and I'm 6'3" adult man, but I ran across that courtyard like a little child, scurrying up to her and jumping into her arms. And she hugged me and started rubbing my back and just said 2 words over and over again. And I hold on to these words. This week I've held on to them. When I was crushed with shame, I've held on to them. When I see problems that other people say are impossible to solve, I hold on to them. When I refuse to surrender and say, if I could just do one action this day of kindness or decency or love, that can make a difference. That can leap time and space. I hold on to these words. I share them with you because that's what we celebrate today. This woman rubbed my back and said over and over again, stay faithful, stay faithful, stay faithful. We cannot give up in the cause of our country. The dream still demands. There still is a chorus of our ancestors calling for our conviction. There is injustice in our midst. We're called to make real on a promise that yet has not been fulfilled. Let us stay faithful because we've come this far by faith. Let us stay faithful because I'm one of those believers that small faith the size of a mustard seed can indeed move mountains. Let's stay faithful in each other and never give up on anyone, no matter who they are, who they voted for. Let us see the divinity in every person and rise to that level of grace and dignity. And I promise you that with that kind of conviction, with that kind of love, with that faith, our actions may be small, but one to another, together our actions will transform this country. And we will shine so brightly that even after we're gone, generations yet unborn will feel our warmth and our light, and we'll have illuminated a new day. Thank you and congratulations.